Speaking to you today is Dr. John Shefelbine. He is currently a professor of education at California State University, Sacramento. He received his doctorate at Stanford University in educational psychology with an emphasis in literature. He has been an elementary school teacher for over 10 years and has taught in the states of Idaho, Alaska, New Mexico, and California. His students were usually in Title I schools and were designated as English language learners. He presently is a member of the Technical Task Force on Reading Standards for the Commission on Teacher Credentialing, a member of the K-12 English Language Arts Framework Development Committee, and a faculty associate of the CSU Chancellor's Office Center for the Improvement of Reading Instruction.
This is going to echo very quickly and briefly what I said when I introduced the program advisory. There's a danger when you have a presentation that deals on a rather focused. You think that we think that this is all there is to literacy. And I want to be very clear to you that when we talked about balanced literacy instruction, that we mean more than phonemic awareness, more than explicit instruction in phonics, more than explicit instruction in spelling. It's just part of a much larger picture, and we're just trying to remind you once again that we know this. We hope that you know this. We hope that you realize that the program advisory was adding extra information to a framework that is currently in existence. And much of the current framework, I think, I can't guarantee you, you will see continued in its newest version. And while I cannot speak for the committee and would never dare so, I can tell you that some of the themes that I will echo for you today are very present in our discussions as we work on the language arts framework, the new one. And sort of central to this framework is our sense that academic language and comprehension is a critical strand in any balanced reading program. And the reason it's so critical is that I can show you a lot of kids who are having difficulty in 3rd and 4th grade, many times because they don't have the language of text. They haven't had much experience with it. They don't understand it well. They don't understand the text even when it's read to them. If we don't acknowledge this as an important issue, it's easy to overlook in beginning reading instruction the critical role that comprehension has to occupy from the very beginning of schooling. I'm talking pre-K for sure, if possible, and kindergarten for sure. Now, two elements of academic language and comprehension would involve one, background knowledge and vocabulary development, and a second one would be comprehension strategies. And they're really quite different because background knowledge and vocabulary are not strategies. What they really are is sort of content information, and I'm going to suggest to you that they're primarily learned through literacy as a way of life. And the kind of classroom that we envision are classrooms where there's an enormous amount of reading to, reading by students, as well as writing by students, writing with students. Literacy is practiced in such a meaningful manner that literally students sort of make it part of their everyday life and grow stronger and stronger as they live it. Now, I can't stress this enough because background knowledge and vocabulary is not something you can catch up on very quickly if you don't have it when you hit 3rd and 4th grade. Now, the comprehension strategy part of the whole framework is somewhat different. These are strategies. We could call them skills. These are things that can be systematically taught. It's important that these strategies will not work if students do not have adequate understanding of the content that they're reading about, or they're being asked to write about, or that is being read to them. So again, the interplay between background knowledge and vocabulary and comprehension strategies is a very critical one. You have to do both in order to move ahead. Now, in the classroom in which there's academic language and comprehension being practiced so much, literally would be a classroom filled with all kinds of reading materials. And many of these reading materials hopefully would be materials that would stretch students' understanding of the language, basically by many times reading to them above the levels that they can read. So they can understand, begin to understand the language of books, the language that is not practiced nearly as much in some homes as we would hope so. Now, a second strand that I'm going to really stress, and the one that we're focusing more on today, is a strand that focuses on fluent automatic reading. This is quite different from the comprehension strand. Here, many times, especially in the primary grades, we're dealing with students who are reading materials in which comprehension is not an issue. The language and sort of content of these beginning reading materials is below what kids can actually comprehend. You should not look at these beginning reading materials, which are focusing on developed fluency, as a central part of the comprehension development program, because they do not challenge students sufficiently. That is why I think it's so helpful to think of two strands of instruction in the primary grades: an academic language strand that focuses on comprehension, and a fluency strand that focuses on encouraging students to become independent, automatic, fluent readers. Now, two key elements in becoming fluent. The first one involves massive practice. I cannot say this enough, and in many of my talks I've emphasized how my concern is that there is not enough reading going on in a lot of the classrooms that I visit. I say this kindly, by the way. We chose literature as part of our core curricula, which I think makes a lot of sense, but for many of the students, this literature is too hard for them to read. So what we've ended up doing is reading it to them. This is appropriate, because that means they have access to the information even though they can't read it independently. The problem is that students who are being read to frequently don't do much reading at other parts of the day. This is even the case if you have something like sustained silent reading going on in your class, because when students aren't fluent, frequently they will choose not to read because it is not very much fun. In fact, sometimes we would almost rather not listen to them because it's not very much fun. It's just the non-fluent reader is just not a happy state of affairs. And what's happening during sustained silent reading time is the non-fluent kids basically are not reading, they're looking at pictures. So the issue of how to get more practice going on in our classes is a critical one, and I'm going to suggest it's critical even for the kids who are already fluent. A question I think you need to ask yourself, and we certainly need to ask ourselves, all of us, is, are all the kids basically spending a substantial amount of time every single day reading to and for themselves at a level where they can be successful? And a little sort of goal that I've sort of mentioned, or criteria or standard, is 30 minutes a day, to me, seems minimum when this kind of reading should be going on. And I don't mean 30 minutes straight. It could be broken up into 10 minutes here or 15 minutes here or there. Now, I'm talking about when kids are actually doing the reading. I'm not talking about them listening, or I'm not talking them looking at pages or pictures. I think we should allow kids to look at picture books during sustained silent reading, but we should be conscious of the fact that that does not equal massive reading practice. Massive reading practice for non-fluent kids has to be rather carefully managed, meaning that because you're non-fluent, you don't choose to read. But I know as a teacher that if I don't get you reading, you're not going to become fluent. So basically, even though you don't want to, in my class, you have to. And I'm going to make you. And I call this tough love reading. And it sounds funny, but the notion is that for the kids who aren't fluent, you can't give them literacy practice as a choice, because many times they will not choose it. And so what you do, and this is very critical in the first and second grade, is you basically say to these kids, I know it's not that fun. You're still going to do it. Trust me, if we do it enough, if you do it enough, it will get better, and all of a sudden, it will start making sense to you. Now, the reason fluent reading is so crucial is that if kids are not fluent, they don't understand what they read. And since we want them to read for meaning, you must sort of see that making them fluent is a critical first step. It's a major reason why you will see us emphasizing at least two of the major topics that we're talking about today. Clearly, phonemic awareness and systematic instruction in phonics can play a central role in helping students become fluent. But I want to emphasize again that just teaching phonemic awareness and systematic phonics will not make the kids fluent if they do not read an enormous amount. I don't think we have any sense of how much kids have to read. And the irony is that if you practice any kind of take-turn reading, where kids go around taking turns, the amount of practice that actually takes place is very limited. In fact, I'm rather forceful on this topic. I'm saying, in terms of all of those various take-turn formats, whether it's round-robin reading, popcorn reading, Quaker reading, I'm just saying, don't do it. As a general practice, I would not do it. Much better to have kids do reading to and for themselves while you walk around and monitor their reading. Much stronger model for practice than to have kids taking turns while other kids supposedly follow. Now, we think that when the other kids are following, we're giving them practice because we punish them by basically not giving them a turn if they've missed their place. And their day is ruined, actually. But really, what is happening, please realize that even when kids are following, they're following the text when somebody else is doing the reading is not the same as they're doing the reading. So don't be confused by that as a very powerful model for fluency practice and development. I don't think it is. Now, the model that I am encouraging you to consider is a somewhat different model than maybe you've been hearing about. Because the model that I'm encouraging you to consider is a model where there's an enormous amount of independent reading practice, particularly for fluency development. But that fluency practice is supported by rather systematic instruction in word recognition strategies. These are the strategies that enable kids to figure out unfamiliar words when they come to them as they practice reading. So the model is a rather simple one. If I'm not very fluent, the way I become fluent is, first of all, by doing a lot of practice, but secondly, and this is where the teacher is very important, by knowing how to figure out most of the words I can't recognize in print when I get to them. That's where my word recognition strategies come in a critical way. So I'm reading along, I come to a word I don't know, I use word recognition strategies and figure it out. Keep on reading, come to that same word, still don't know it, use word recognition strategies, I can't even say that, and figure it out. I may have to use those strategies 5, 10, 15 times before I know that word. So notice the word recognition strategies enable me to figure out the print, but the way I become automatic is by rereading that word again and again and again in context, I hope, so many times that eventually I recognize it. Now, the real question is, and this is where things start to get a little hot and heavy. I don't think anybody would disagree with what I said so far. I hope you wouldn't. I mean, nobody would disagree with the importance of academic language, and comprehension is a major strand. Nobody would disagree that fluency is critical. No one disagreed that we have to do an enormous amount of reading. The real issue that still, I think, presents some disagreement involves the 3 cueing systems. Sometimes there are 4, but let's stick with 3 for today. And you probably know them by heart. there's the semantic and syntactic cueing systems, and these involve using context to figure out unfamiliar print. And then there are the graphophonic cues that basically involve using letter sound information. And the real question is, what is the relative importance of these cueing systems, of these cues, different cues, to figure out unfamiliar print? And what role do they have in developing fluent reading? I've already suggested to you that word recognition strategies have a major role in developing fluency because those are the strategies kids use to figure out print when they come to words they can't recognize. And by using those strategies over and over again, they become more fluent. Now, there are basically two different theories of reading acquisition. And on one side, we have what are called stage models, and on the other side, we have what are called, on one side, we have the non-stage models, on the other side, we have stage models. Non-stage models basically believe that skilled and unskilled readers use the same strategies to figure out unfamiliar print. And basically, the strategies they use are context first, backed up by graphophonic information, if necessary. Now, you may think that this is a who cares kind of issue, but it's very important when you're teaching kids. And I will tell you that a lot of the instruction that we've been doing, even back in the days of the so-called skills-based instruction, back in the 70s and 80s, followed a model where when kids were trying to figure out print, they were asked to use context in addition to first and last consonant sounds. That sort of fits into this context plus graphophonic information model. The idea is that you use the consonant information as a backup to confirm your prediction of what you think the word is going to be. I want to be clear here, though. We're talking about context to figure out print that we can't immediately recognize. That's what we're talking about. When we're talking about theories of theories of reading acquisition, we're talking about what are the strategies kids use to figure out print that they don't immediately recognize. We are not talking about context to figure out word meanings. Nobody disagrees with that. Everybody acknowledges that context is an important part of figuring out the meanings of words. Even the meanings of words you already know the meanings of. If you say, he hit a home run, obviously you're using context to figure out what the meaning of the word run is. Nobody is arguing about that. But that's not the issue of context that we're discussing here. Here we're talking about what is the role of context in even decoding the word run before I use context to figure out what meaning it has after I've decoded it. Is that clear to you? Very important distinction, because if we're not careful about our use of labels, what will happen is that people will start arguing about issues that really involve different assumptions, and that's not really what we should be doing if, in fact, we are more in agreement once we clarify what we mean. Now, on the stage model side, it is basically suggested that skilled readers and unskilled readers use different strategies to figure out unfamiliar print. That unskilled readers start off by basically attending to context because they do not understand that words can sort of be figured out using letter-sound relationships. These beginning readers do not understand that English is an alphabetic writing system. They do not understand that words are made up of sounds. In fact, many of these beginning readers don't know what a word is. Neither do they know what a letter is or a sound. Neither do they know first and last, by the way, which makes our instruction rather difficult. because we're talking about all these things and they don't have the foggiest notion of what we're saying. They just want to try hard and they'd like to read. So ultimately, they do that which makes the most sense to them. And guess what that is? They will use context, and frequently they'll just try to memorize the story because that they can do. And they will look at pictures as source of information. And they will try to memorize words as wholes. They'll try to memorize the whole word because that makes sense to them. Very, very important idea is that kids start off in this rather naive understanding, and there are many reasons for this. You have to understand that up until the time that you come to school, there is no real reason why you would need to know that words are made up of sounds. You're a wonderful speaker of English as a child who's 5 years old. Rarely in your daily interactions do you have to go around sort of saying, oh, sit has 3 sounds. Isn't that interesting? Nobody's going to say s, e, t. Unless you have parents who are trying to do code words, right, across the table. Sometimes we do it. That's an interesting thing. Instead of spelling it, parents ought to do this phonemic code working processing. It probably would result in a great deal of learning rather quickly, and all those phonemic awareness people would be out of business. Including myself. Okay. So this model, the stage model, says that students need to progress on to a different stage in which they now appreciate that spelling sound information is more powerful than context. This does not mean that context doesn't play a role. It's supportive. It's secondary, it's not primary. I hope you can appreciate what I just said, because what I just said contradicts what the non-stage model is saying. Non-stage says context first, back up with phonics if necessary, and the phonics that is most powerful is phonics with consonants. Stage model is saying we can understand why you might start that way. But early on, particularly second half of kindergarten and clearly in first grade, a major goal of the teacher is to start moving the child into this strategy, choice, or selection, where they now will say, as they practice reading, I don't know this word. The thing I need to do, if possible, is to use spelling sound information to figure it out, and that includes not only consonant information, but also vowel information. That way, I look at all of the print. Now, this model says, in this stage 2, that if kids adopt these strategies, and if you give them an enormous amount of practice, they will become fluent. And they will adopt the strategies, actually they will not adopt them, they will develop the strategies of skilled readers where they're so efficient in figuring out spelling sound patterns and recognizing them that they're literally effortless when they read words. Now, I hope you see the contrast between the non-stage and the stage. You need to understand it because I think that explains why, even today, there's strong differences of opinion upon how we should be doing reading instruction in first grade. I hate to say this, but much of this centers on what do you do in first grade. More importantly, what do you do in the first half of first grade? That's really the issue. Because literally, you can do a lot of emergent reading kinds of activities in kindergarten that would fit both models rather nicely. The question is, does there need to be a rather strong, explicit redirection of students so that they all see that spelling sound strategies are more powerful? And if this is the case, what would this instruction look like? Very important question. So, I hope you realize, and this is something, if you do not agree with what I'm about to say, you should read up on it Certainly, the county offices of education are trying to provide you with an abundance of information so that you can inform yourselves. There's a substantial amount of evidence in favor of stage models of reading acquisition, and there's not much support for non-stage models. Very quickly, the gist is this. Skilled readers, when they read, primarily look at the print. They primarily look at virtually every letter and virtually every word. This is not a slow, laborious process. It is quick, automatic, and it is based upon their incredible familiarity with spelling patterns that includes a very strong phonological awareness such that they can read patterns that they've never even seen before. So it's not just a memory of past patterns, it's a generalizable kind of skill where I can read new patterns based upon my understanding of the components that can be used. It turns out that the people who are relying on context as their preferred strategy tend to be the poorer readers. So it's just sort of the opposite of what non-stage models would predict. The reason this is important is I think a lot of our most recent reading instructional practices have been based more on non-stage models of reading acquisition. The notion that learning to read is as easy as learning to speak, and that the way I get you to read is by doing a lot of reading. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but the way we do that is by using text that is so predictable, or language experience stories that I know the meaning of already, that I can literally, quote unquote, read it. That is the model, that is the instructional practice that would sort of be supported by non-stage models. And I see a lot of those kinds of practices still being favored. I'm going to suggest to you, and we're going to suggest to you today, I'm going to comment on his overhead. Shefelbine needs to work on his overhead. So at the very least, figure out how to hold it on the What we're going to try to show you today is that systematic instruction in phonemic awareness makes all the difference in terms of kids going through the spelling sound stage. That in the past, a lot of kids did not go through this stage because our instruction was inadequate. So those people who say we're going back to the phonics of old, I hope that's not the case, because I'm going to suggest to you that the phonics of old did not do what we're talking about today. I'll give you one very quick example, and we'll be coming back to that in a minute. But one component of phonemic awareness is blending, the ability to put sounds together. And I can show you kids who've been taught the phonic sounds in a word like sit, and when you ask them to read it, they go s, I, t, and then they say Tim. Now, in the old days, we would say, well, here's another worksheet. That's one thing we would have said. And take another one home just for good measure. We also would have said, maybe you're not. Maybe you are a visual learner. Now, you laugh, but there's a lot of labeling in this area going on. The notion is that some kids will learn to read visually, and other ones are more auditory learners, and the auditory learners get phonics. Now, this is not a good model, folks. First of all, it is not supported by the research. In terms of learning to read, it is not supported by the research. There's no strong evidence saying that kids will successfully learn to read using a quote-unquote visual approach. I'll tell you what, they'll get through first grade many times. They'll memorize enough sight words that they'll think they're doing okay, but as soon as the vocabulary load starts going up, these kids are stuck in a major way because each new word has to be learned by in and of itself, and there's no sort of efficient strategy. This is sort of the miracle, and I hate to be dramatic about it, but it really is the miracle of an alphabetic system, is that if you've got the parts down, literally, you are incredibly efficient at applying it to an enormous number of words. The problem is that it's harder to adopt this strategy initially, partly because the kids don't have any sense that words are made up of sounds, and this is part of phonological and phonemic awareness that we'll be talking about, partly because using context and memorizing stories is so much more attractive. So the kids literally want to do that which makes the most sense to them. And again, the irony is, if we were to focus on sort of prediction and meaning and sight word instruction, initially there seems to be a pretty good payoff. What I'm going to suggest to you is, though, that payoff does not stay strong. And the studies of phonics that have gone on for many, many years suggest this rather clearly. That if you compare a sight word approach with a phonics approach, at the end of first grade, many times the sight word approach is ahead. Second grade, not so. Takes longer sometimes to learn these strategies. In the end, it's a greater payoff. That's why when you go back to your schools and you look at your program, it's important that you look at what's happening across the grade levels, not just within one grade. Because it's tracking those kids and seeing what's happened as they go up, saying, oh, they were fine here, but now they're having trouble. Why are they having trouble? That needs to be figured out. Very important issue. So I really want to stress one more time that when we're talking about teaching kids to adopt spelling sound strategies, that the kind of instruction we give is going to make all the difference for some kids. In a middle class situation, probably 70% of your kids will get through the spelling sound strategy stage with a minimal amount of explicit instruction. I'm saying that at least 30% of your kids will need something more systematic. Now this raises the immediate question. Can you guess what that question is? How do I identify those 30% who need more? Because the sense is, well, if you don't need to do it with all of them, why just do it with some of them? Well, let me tell you, my view is this. It's very hard sometimes to determine who needs it until after they fail. And what I would prefer that we do is we adopt strategies that are more inclusive from the very beginning, and then make provisions for those students who can go at a faster pace. The assumption frequently is made is that I just can't believe I would do this kind of instruction with everyone because they don't all need it. And I would answer immediately, I hope not. But that doesn't mean that even your more capable students won't benefit from systematic instruction. What it just means is you need to operate at the level where they are rather than treating everybody the same way. And I will suggest to you, from my work in the local schools here, this is a major, major issue. The issue is that we find kids at very different levels within any one grade, and that teachers have to become much more comfortable with the notion of having different groups, flexible groups, based upon the strategy instructional needs of the students, which is different from saying based upon your overall reading level. I hope you see that. Oh, I've been asked to contrast phonics and phonetics. This is important because during the break we had a question regarding, again, the distinction between phonemic awareness and phonics. And one more time, remember, phonemic awareness literally has nothing to do with print. I mean, and the distinction between phonemic awareness and phonics is that phonics does talk about the relationship between sounds and words and the spelling pattern that is used to represent those sounds. So phonics always has a sort of a print-sound relationship, while phonemic awareness, in its pure form, no print is involved at all. Now, what makes it confusing is that when we talk about the role of phonemic awareness, we're showing you how important it is in order to use phonics. That's where I think it becomes confusing, because we illustrate that if you know it, but you can't blend, then that means the phonemic awareness is making it difficult to use your phonic knowledge. Now, phonetics, to my understanding, is sort of it's part of linguistics, and it's the science and study of speech sounds. So it's studying the sounds in speech. And I would argue that phonetics is not the same as phonics, because the study of speech sounds basically is looking at how sounds function in speech, not in print. And there is an international phonetic alphabet, but that alphabet is used to describe how sounds function in speech. Did I say it right? OK. So because frequently you'll hear people saying, well, the kids are having trouble with their phonetics. And then really it would be better to say that they're having trouble with phonics or phonemic awareness or both, but I would just leave phonetics out. OK, now I lost my train of voice, but I think I'll get it back. So what I'm going to try to model for you is, if you haven't read the Vicki Snyder article that I think is in your packet, I encourage you to do so. I consider it wonderfully informative to me. It speaks to me at my level of understanding. And another part I like about it is it's easy to get lost in the forest of phonemic awareness activities. At least it is for me. And before you know it, you say, well, I've got all these different choices. Where am I going to put my money? And that article suggests that blending and segmentation are critically important areas of phonemic awareness, and it gives you some ideas of how they would be taught. I'm just going to briefly model two different approaches to teaching blending. One is going to come from the Torgerson materials, and they, again, are referenced in your handout. They do blending at least 4 different ways in sort of a 2-by-2 contrast. Forget that. But first of all, initially, it's very clear that it's easier to blend an initial consonant with a rhyme, like s, at, than it is to blend individual phonemes, s, at. That's harder. So you will see that in a number of phonemic awareness blending activities, first kids are encouraged to combine an initial consonant with a rhyme or a word family. That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to suggest to you, though, that we need to perhaps go to a second level, and clearly the Torgerson materials do this, is that they go beyond just the word family, because there is a sense, clearly on the part of Torgerson and also the Snyder article, and I would agree too, that eventually kids need to be able to combine sounds at the phoneme level. And our concern is that if you spend all your time just on blending families, say you do an at family and then you do an family, the kids will not be able to blend an am family because you haven't taught am. So they can't read Sam, even though they can do sat, and even though they can do, say, son. So the question is, you can say, well, just teach the am family. Well, you know what's going to happen. Before you know it, you just got a lot of families to teach. I mean, a lot of families. You want them to read peg? I got to teach the egg family. I want them to read pig. I now got to teach the ig family. You see what I'm trying to say? But please don't forget what I just said. It is appropriate to teach blending of families. And if kids are having trouble of blending families, start at that level before you go to the individual phoneme level.
At this point, Dr. Shefelbine demonstrated how colored discs can represent individual phonemes. These colored shapes can be manipulated and blended to represent sounds in words.
Let's see if you can do this. I'm going to push them together now. See if you can figure out what do you think it is? Good job. So notice I'm using the colored markers as sort of something to sort of focus their attention, and also this visual sort of pushing them together so that they can get this idea that when I blend, I'm pushing these sounds together and getting a sense of what they are. Now, Torgerson sort of starts off there, and then they move on into letters. And I want to emphasize the power of having taught kids a few letter-sound relationships. A few, folks. It could be as few as 5 or 4, a vowel and a few consonants. You'd be amazed at how you can start manipulating those with kids. And then now you're using letter-sound sort of relationships to sort of back up and make the blending task even more concrete. And there is some suggestion that when you start using some letters, if the kids know them, now I want you to say ooh when you see these, because this obviously shows that there was some preparation. So now I'm going to do the Torgerson task with letters, but here it would be something to this effect. If I would say, everybody, let's say the sounds. Here's the first one. Next one. Last one. Now let's combine them and push them together. Let's say it. What's the word? Shot. Now, so notice how I graduated from the colored to the actual letters. The condition being that the kids really know these letter-sound relationships. If they don't know those relationships, it's not going to work. And I want to emphasize that you can work on a limited set of letters and get a lot of payoff. Because once the kids get the sense that how this limited set of letters works, they start really figuring out the system on their own in a rather generative manner. This again shows you how some conceptions of phonics instruction may not be as smart as we would like them to be. For example, I know some programs just go pell-mell on trying to teach all the letter-sound relationships as fast as possible. Conceptually, this is hard for a lot of kids. And I'm going to suggest to you that even then, what you really need to be spending some time on before you cover all of the sounds, lickety-split, is can we show kids how we can use these sounds as a way of figuring out unfamiliar print. Because let me tell you, when the kids can sort of figure out that sounding out words is something you can actually do for yourself, it's a huge insight. And it's this wonderful combination of both phonics and phonemic awareness and this knowledge of alphabetic writing that all of a sudden has enormous payoff. OK, now that was sort of the Torgerson model. I'm sure they would be ashamed of what I did and say they're not going to buy my kit. But actually, I'm not trying to advertise them, and I don't have any connection with them, but I'm sort of impressed with what they did. So I do encourage you to look at it, and Louisa has a little description of it. But here's the question I've been asking Louisa and all the other experts, including Marilyn Adams. Kids who cannot blend, when you go at, what's the word? They will say tan. So my question to you is, to what degree is this activity training kids as much as it may need to? And I'm just going to, and I'm not, you see what the problem is I've had you say the sounds, at, and I say, what's the word? And some kids are going to say sat. They can blend. What am I going to do with the kid who says Tim? I send him to the resource specialist, but. No, that's an important question. So I'm going to offer you, this is the part I'm interested in. I don't know of any direct research study on this, but clearly the Vicki Snyder article makes a big point of this, is that if you want to teach blending, a roundabout strategy, maybe you would call this scaffolding. That's always a good term because that means it's OK. But a roundabout strategy is to teach kids to hold and sing the sounds together. So when you do this, you've got them all up there side by side, and you're saying, OK, let's say the sound here. Sat. Now tell me the word, and they'll say sat. Now, it seems that this simple model of holding a sound and then quickly combining it with the next will enable those kids who were saying at Tim to say, oh, it's sat. It's something about, and I don't know what's going on in terms of short-term memory. My hypothesis is, I'm looking at Louisa for help, is that literally when you sing them together, you're holding them there in a way that they can be combined and recognized at a whole much more easily than if they were discrete. I want to emphasize that it's very, very powerful when kids do this sort of blending activity, not only because they figure out the word, but guess what they're looking at when they do this? The print. And when they're looking at all the print and they keep doing this, guess what's being built up in their mind? This increasingly sophisticated and automatic knowledge of spelling patterns. So literally, it's ironic that something that is slow and takes time and that we all think is unnatural literally can have a powerful component to it and will lead to automatic fluent reading down the line.